So over the years, one of my favorite questions that I've heard from people is, why do the prophets make it so difficult? Okay? Why are the teachings so complicated? And I like to say, well, they're not all that complicated. I mean, it's pretty simple when Jesus says you're the light. I mean, that's pretty simple. I mean, puts us on his level, okay? And the Buddha says you're Buddha too. I mean, that's like really simple. Problem is, we don't believe that. We don't believe we're capable of rising to the Buddha or the Christ level. We don't believe that. It's because we have a little enemy inside of us, which is the devil. It's called the ego. The human ego, which I'm going to explain, how that came about from this drawing. The human ego is the defense to our offense, which is our spirit. Imagine how easy it would be if you're trying to shoot a basket with no defense. It gets much easier. Or trying to score a touchdown without a defense. Sometimes I think the Steelers might not score this year, even if there's no defense. But if you don't have a defense, it's so much easier. But my goodness, with the defense, it makes it harder to do. It also makes it valuable. It makes it more interesting for many reasons. And the problem is, what we are, the offense, which is the spirit, we end up identifying with the defense, which is the ego. And it's the thing that keeps us from scoring, and we have to learn how to beat that thing, okay? And that's a great challenge. And so as simple as you are the light, or we're all children of God, or we're all one, as simple as a concept that is, the ego always shows up to try to confound us and say things like, well, that's not really the case, but this situation is different, and no, you should love most enemies, but not that guy, okay? Or there's some things in the world that aren't tolerable. Meanwhile, Jesus says, forgive everything with no exceptions, okay? And so we're going to talk about how the ego got formed, but also address that specific idea of why things are difficult and how we can circumvent that. We can sort of end around and look at it a little different, and then it'll become a lot easier. So two things happened to me in the last week. I read a Zen saying that I'm going to share with you in a minute. And combined with, I have a friend who's reading the Tao Te Ching, and she asked, can you clarify verse 3 for me? Okay, she said she was struggling with it. So I'm going to combine the Zen saying with the chapter or verse 3 of the Tao, and weave in some Rumi and a great line from Genesis that is confusing to a lot of people, and try to weave it all together. But first, we will start with this little drawing. Here I have drawn for you the Big Bang. Okay, precise, isn't it? It's also the first verse of the Tao Te Ching. Okay, so this little black spot, which will represent the Big Bang itself, or in the first verse of the Tao, it says that the Tao, nameless, the Tao is the origin of all things, but named, it's the mother of 10,000 things. So I've drawn about 8, okay? The mother of 10,000 things means the Big Bang happened, and then all the stuff came out of that. I mean, I drew a person, a little person, and a football and some money, and that, you can't tell, it's brown and great flavor. That's an open face peanut butter jelly sandwich. Okay, so whatever you want to think of, it got created by the Tao, which was the origin, is the mother of 10,000 things. So it's all the stuff that's named, because I can name a sandwich, I can name money, I can name a body, I can name physical things. As nameless, it's the origin of 10,000. It's the origin of us. It's the origin of our experience. It's actually our pathway back home. But it's nameless because there are no words for it. It's beyond words. It's beyond description. It's an experience. It's why Ram Dass says, for those who have had the experience, no explanation is necessary. For those who haven't had the experience, no explanation is possible. Basically, that's the same thing as the Tao can't be named. And so as nameless, it is the origin, and we can bring ourselves back home using that concept, okay? And I did it here using this orange color. What we have, the ego, is when the Big Bang happens and a bunch of separation happens. And there's planets, and then there's people, and there's countries and borders and stuff, and then we have races and genders and age and sexual orientation, political affiliation, all this separation, right? Boom, out of the Big Bang, and then here we are, all this separation. I only just drew a couple things, okay? But the experience of separation is the ego, okay? The reason why we have ego is because we identify with the thing that's separate. I'm a physical being identifying with my physical self, and it's different than your physical self, and it's different than a football and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, okay? These things are different, but they come from the same source, and yet they're different. That's where the labels come in, and that's where all the suffering comes in, because we identify with the separation. And the ego, simple definition, is physical focus. And that is the mother of 10,000 things. I just named it, okay? Well, name less. What is that? Well, it's this orange pathway I have here. From the beginning, whenever that was, and currently right now, there's always been a frequency or a vibration or a source of energy, I have it drawn in orange, that is available to all. We'll just call it Spirit or the Holy Spirit. You can call it Zen, you can call it Tao, whatever. It exists. And that's available to everyone. Not many footballs and dollar bills and sandwiches are seeking it. Okay, maybe they have it automatically, I don't know. But for our purposes, the ego has a hard time believing this thing could possibly be true. We all came from the same source, and connecting to that thing called the Spirit will lead you right back. In fact, from this spot, here's where you feel the connection of unity. Here's where you feel the oneness of everything, and Einstein's entanglement shows up right there too. It is all connected. We know that energetically anyways, okay? It's already connected. It's the ego that says, no, it's not. It's separate. You're different than I am. You're better than I am, or you're worse than I am, or anything along those lines. And the truth is, we're completely equal, all of us, at all times, always equal. And so that's part of verse 3 of the Tao, okay? When we start to evaluate things as better than or worse than, that's what leads to the problem. Well, if every single being has access to the Spirit, one, every single being is equal, and two, it's completely fair. Not all of us have access to the White House or even good health care or the ability to dunk a basketball or anything, but all of us have access to the Spirit. The ego is going to go, no, that's not fair. The world's not fair. It's going to complain about things. Why did Jesus go to the cross? For completely unfair reasons, the man was murdered. And what was he trying to show us? Well, as long as you access the Spirit, no matter what you go through, you're good to go. Okay? Does not matter the circumstance or the situation. In fact, probably better off, as he says, blessed are the persecuted. Probably better off if you're going through some adversity, because you're going to be way more likely to look for this pathway back home. Okay? And so that's what that drawing is about. Make sense? Simply enough. Now we'll go through these verses. So the Zen saying that I came across was this, that religion often fails, or especially the state of the world right now, religion is a major issue because the ego is trying to understand it. The ego tries to name it, and the ego sets up dogma, right? Things we need to do, okay, in order to please some sort of God or whatever the case may be. The ego is the thing that messes it up. The Zen saying is this, most of religion, most of the time, is like going to a restaurant, reading the menu, picking what you want to eat off the menu, because, it looks good, little picture there, and then the description, toasted cheese and, sauce or whatever. Oh, that looks good. I'll have this, please, right? And then the waitress brings you back a plate with the description on it, and you eat it. You eat the menu, okay? That's what most religion is. Trying to chew on dogma, okay? It doesn't deliver the goods. You know what the Zen saying is? Eat the meal. You don't have spirit if you're eating the menu, if we're just gobbling up dogma, okay? We have to live it out. We have to be it. It has to be the food that we eat, has to be the Spirit. And most religions, again, insist on it has to be like this or it has to be like this, and that's why it's restrictive. And all the prophets teach one way or another, well, that's not enough. We have to love each other and join with each other without any exception, including loving your enemies, okay? And so that's the Zen saying. I like that a lot. Let's not just eat the actual menu, let's eat the meal. That's what we have to go looking for, to actually eat the meal. So verse 3 of the Tao is this. Putting a value on status will create contentiousness. If you overvalue possessions, people will begin to steal. By not displaying what is desirable, you will cause the people's hearts to remain undisturbed. The sage governs by emptying minds and hearts, by weakening ambitions and strengthening bones. Practice not doing. When action is pure and selfless, everything settles into its own perfect place. And that's an important line. Everything settles into its own perfect place when we follow the Tao, okay? This first part, what it's all about is degrees of importance. What's better than? What's worse than? When we are focusing on possessions as being better than or worse than. Or other variations or translations talk about superior people and inferior people, right? Who's better at this, who's better at that. I've done it for years with football games, which team is better, right? Or which political opinion is better. What's Rumi say? Out there, beyond right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Okay, that's what the Tao is trying to get us to see. All right, stop with the evaluation of better than, worse than. I already went through it. There's only one thing that's going on. Connect to the spirit and you're good. Period. Nothing else to debate. And who has access to that? Everyone equally. In fact, the Tao, as it says, the Tao has no depth to it. It has no limits. There's no degrees of spirit. So you could just keep going and going and going with it. There's a whole lot of limitations on my pocketbook, though, and money, or my height, or my hair, on and on with physical world things, but there's no limitations in the spiritual world. So what are we debating? What's the contentiousness this verse talks about? It's when we break off into all these separations and we argue about football and money and food and things like that. It's not spirit. In fact, American political system is all about arguing about stuff and who's right and wrong about this or that. Religion's been doing that for thousands of years, and look what happens. Okay? Not working, because it's not accessing spirit. Spirit says something completely different. Spirit says, it's all good all the time. Never have to worry about anything. Stay here, stay there, stay focused on spirit. That's it. Stay in the Tao. Stay there, as the Tao says later on. Anchor yourself in it. And then you'll see it's all working just as it needs to. That's the end of that verse. Everything settles into its own perfect place. Because if we get the ego out of the way and stop thinking like separate beings and we start thinking like selfless unity beings, if we do that, we gain access to the spirit. But what does that look like? I have to want for you the exact same peace I want for myself. And that is Trump or Biden, with no exceptions. You have to want it for both of them. You have to want it for the Patriots and the Ravens and the Steelers. You have to want it for everyone, okay? And it doesn't mean it's about winning or losing. I can still want the Steelers to win. I can still want my political opinions to follow through as well. But I sure as heck better have the peacemaking, loving spirit at the other side of that, or at least backed up by that, okay? And so the Tao verse is saying, let's be careful, mindful of judging things as better than or worse than. And as soon as we stop doing that and we access the spirit, guess what? It's going to settle into its own perfect place anyways. And this goes straight to a couple Rumi sayings, the one we just did last week, that don't be lonely, says Rumi, the whole universe is inside you. Now, once I did this drawing, I'm like, well, there you go. This thing here, it's a loop. The universe, which exploded into this particular physical experience that we're all having, also placed itself inside of you. And so you don't have to go very far to find the entire universe. It's already in you. The source is in you. And so completion is in you. And then the ego will say, that's absurd. Go look at how big the universe is. Okay? The universe is huge. You think that it's all inside of you? It doesn't make any sense. Well, that's what Nicodemus tried to discuss with Jesus once, when Jesus says you have to be born again. And Nicodemus said, how do I get back in my mother's womb? And that's in scripture, right? And Nicodemus sort of looked silly. Jesus probably rolled his eyes, at least a little bit. And he said, Nicodemus, you're born once of flesh, you're born a second time of spirit. Okay? Well, I've drawn it. We're born into the flesh, and then when we find the spirit, you're born again. No exceptions. Everyone has to do this. Okay? And so Rumi also says, I am so small, because he recognized the word I, again, in Greek is ego, okay? So the ego is so small because the ego is this little dude, okay? I'm this little physical being. I'm so small compared to the universe. I'm so small I can barely be seen. How can this great love be inside of me, says Rumi. And it is because the source of the universe is inside each one of us. And when it's tapped into, it feels like tremendous love. Again, it's when I intersect with that place even for a moment, I realize, man, I get why Jesus would go to a cross with that type of love inside of him. It was that important to him to get everyone else to feel that type of love. Wow. All right, and everyone that does that type of activity, even if it's just a little teeny tiny bit of it, is tapping into deep, deep, deep love, like agape style love. And Rumi's like, wow, how could that be inside of me? And then he says, but look at your eyes. They're so small, but they see enormous things. Isn't that awesome? Teeny tiny eyeball like this. I could peer out into the universe and see all of it. Just a Grand Canyon, what a spectacle. Little eyeballs are capable of seeing so much. Isn't that awesome? Well, that's where I introduced my weekly drawing of a soul blob. I don't know how to draw a soul, but here I've got a happy soul with the third eye activated. And what is Rumi talking about? Also, when your third eye is active, you're capable of seeing everything, okay? And you can see how it all fits together, how it all works, because it does all work together. Like the Tao says, it settles in its own perfect place. Everything has always been unfolding just as it needs to. The ego's going to go, no, that's crazy. Look at the chaos in the world, Look at the pain and suffering. I'm like, well, okay, that's what the ego says. You know what the spirit will say? Go to the masters. And all the masters, I'm talking Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad in particular, were miserable at some point in their lives. They know what they're talking about. Good street cred. Okay, Buddha was a millionaire, and yet he was depressed and abandoned his wife. And he realized the only way to peace is also back through spirit. Jesus, of course, you know the story. My goodness, he was murdered unfairly. And Muhammad was totally broke for 25 years or so. And poor, and lived in poverty until he focused for 10 years, and then the Quran came through him, and through all the revelations. It's the same thing. We all have access to that. Buddha, by the way, and one wonderful little teaching I read, he didn't talk about a God. Why? Because when you talk about God, where's the ego put God? The ego puts God outside of us. And so he stayed away. It's not that he didn't believe in such a thing, as long as he described God as love. When we mention God, the ego immediately thinks God is out there, because the ego isn't able to understand and grasp what God is. Remember, it's the defense, okay? And that reminds me of a teaching from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which says when you start a spiritual journey, the ego says, great idea, I'll join you, all right? We could both learn something. And that's what screws up religion so often. Ego trying to interpret this incredibly high-level spiritual teachings. And they try to put labels on it as to what we're supposed to be doing, and yet there's no labels. It's free of all of that. And so the ego will trip us up again as the defense that it is, okay? So we are capable of seeing all of this. We're capable of experiencing all of this. Everybody is, without exception. Which leads us to Genesis 2:17, and it's one of those things that people do get confused by, and it's a teaching that sounds fairly confusing, at least it can be, and a lot of people discard Christianity pretty quickly because of it. Genesis 2:17 says, "Do not eat off of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for if you do, you will surely die." Now, most people consider that to be anti-intellectual statement. Don't eat off the tree of knowledge, right? And nor do you want to eat off a tree that is knowledge of good and evil. Well, you're ignorant if you don't think there's evil, right? We're in a world, there's definitely good and evil, right? Of course, that's what the ego thinks. And knowledge, of course, the ego, knowledge, intelligence, especially in this country, it's supremely important. The smarter you are, the better, right? Well, don't eat off that tree, we are told in Genesis. Well, I just drew it for you. Here's the idea. As soon as you explode into the world physically, you take on the ego, which is separation, we start to make decisions about what's good and what's bad. The Tao, that verse right there, it's about deciding what's good and what's bad. It's the exact same teaching as Genesis 2:17. The Tao says, yeah, don't do that. Don't start saying what's good and what's bad. And if you start deciding that things are evil, if you start making that decision, you're just going to strengthen the ego's muscles anyways. And then you're going to dig in deep with that, and you're going to try to do what people have been trying to do for thousands and thousands of years, change the world physically. We don't change the world physically. It can't be done. And no one's ever going to use power, as the Tao goes on to say. No one's going to use weapons at any point to beat anyone. You can win a war, but you're not going to change minds and hearts that way. The real war, like in Islam, the real war is the jihad, which is the war that happens inside your own head. The war between you and you. The Bhagavad Gita talks about it the same way in Hinduism. The war is between you and you. And it's between you and your decision to decide to stay ego-focused or your decision to go on a spiritual journey. And that requires, as John says, I must decrease so he may increase. And so whatever it is that is your I has to decrease. And then automatically the spirit shows up in its place. But that requires a personal crucifixion. The I must die. And that's what Jesus means by you got to carry your cross. And why Paul says, I am crucified with Christ. Okay? Because all of us are on that journey of defeating the I. Well, why will we surely die? Because if you think you're a body, you will surely die. The body dies. But if you know you're not the body, this is, I think, verse 7 or so, early on in the Tao also, it says, if you think you're a body, you will die. If you know you're not a body, you can never die. Well, geez, what was Jesus trying to do? He's trying to show us you cannot die. You know, kill the body can't kill what you really are, and yet we're down here worried about the flesh so much. John 6:63, the flesh counts for nothing. The Spirit gives life. Boom. And so all this debate, like it says in Tao 3, the contentiousness comes from all these arguments about who's right and who's wrong. Ain't ever going to get anywhere with that. The only way, although you actually do get somewhere, you can get to a point where you realize, there's a bit of a glass ceiling. Good luck changing the world once you might be right about a certain point, okay? But that doesn't make you righteous. To defeat the ego is the way to get back to the Spirit. So, Genesis 2:17, don't eat off the tree of knowledge and good and evil, because from the universal perspective, everyone else asks, why does God let people suffer? Well, from God's perspective, there isn't suffering. Why would he let his own son die, as the story goes? Do you think Jesus saw it as suffering? No, he saw it as opportunity. And that's the key. He knew that he could teach us with that suffering. He could spread love throughout the world. Did he like it? No. In fact, the word like it almost never shows up in any teaching I've ever read. You must like your enemy. No, it doesn't say that anywhere, okay? You don't have to like your adversity. You just have to love it. You have to trust it. And when you go through difficult times and you embrace it somehow, embrace the pain, you'll win the game. If you do that, it's because the ego hates that. The ego's job is to create or to avoid pain or seek pleasure. That's what the ego does. And when you embrace pain, the ego goes, oh man, he doesn't have a need for me anymore. And that's why you don't want to eat off the tree of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, because from the spiritual perspective, there isn't any. Okay? It's all unified. The Kabbalah teaches that the devil is just the other side of God, the God coin anyways. All pain is, or suffering is the other side of love, promoting you over to love. Okay? And so it's actually love anyway. Suffering promotes love. I've worked with thousands of people in addiction. Withdrawal promotes healing. Okay? The difficult stuff we go through, especially in relationships, it promotes some sort of peacemaking skill. Because who wants to stick with their suffering? No one. But the suffering is actually promoting growth. So it's all love. And that is eating from the tree of life. Okay? And that's the tree we're allowed to eat from. In fact, all the other trees in the garden you're allowed to eat from. We're allowed to have whatever experiences we want to down here. Just be careful of that one trap. When you start to evaluate things, like in the Tao verse, when we start to evaluate things as good and bad, now you're going to surely die. But once you stop doing that, and once we join together and work on this together, now we're eating off the tree of life. That's the Zen saying, okay? Now we're eating what we're supposed to be eating.